Hi, I'm Show-ei-mon. Today, I'll explain how to shorten jeans by keeping the original hem. The before and the after look like this. I'll also explain the key points of the process in detail, so please watch through to the end. On this channel, I share videos where you can carefully follow clothing alterations all the way through to the finished result. They are filmed from the actual worker's point of view, so you can check professional hand movements clearly. Please use them as training videos for those aiming to become professionals. Now then, let's get straight to work. First, I'll start by cutting. One thing to keep in mind when finishing the hem with this method is that, compared to their condition before alteration, the hem will become stiffer. Since 5 layers of fabric will be sewn together, it becomes stiff, almost as if boning has been inserted. It will gradually soften as they are worn, but even so, some stiffness will remain. Some people do not like this stiffness, so be sure to explain it properly when taking the job. Now then, the finished length line has been marked. If this were a rolled hem, you would add the hem allowance after this and mark the cutting line. But with this method, you cut at a point shorter than the finished line. First, note down the current stitch width. Draw a line at the same measurement as the stitch width, in the direction that makes the jeans shorter than the finished line. Cut at a point about 5 to 7 millimeters below the second line you drew. We'll sew the second line to the original hem later on. Cut the hem off the fabric that was cut. Be sure to leave about 7 millimeters of fabric from the edge of the three-fold hem. This is how it will be sewn on. Undo the stitches. Originally, it is chain stitched. But since I do not have a chain stitch machine, I'll finish it with a regular sewing machine this time. I was able to unpick it all cleanly, so I'll use this top thread. The bobbin thread is too fine, so I won't use it this time. Press the unsewn top thread with an iron to straighten it. When altering jeans, the thread from an unsewn chain stitch may be usable as lock stitch sewing thread. So try to keep it whenever possible. Since it is the thread that was originally used, both the thickness and the color will match the original finish. This is how long the thread becomes after pressing it with an iron. If you have about this much thread, it should be enough to stitch one leg of the jeans. Now I'll sew the main body and the hem section together. The thread used for joining them should not stand out too much. So I'll use a number 50 thread that matches the color of the back side of the fabric. First, baste both the inseam and the outseam. Now, here's a key point when sewing them together. There's a slightly whitened area just above the original seam. Match that point to the line you drew earlier. At the whitened area, there is a point where the fabric naturally folds. So match that point to the line. Also align the side seam. Baste it at the point where it folds naturally. Like this. Baste the outer side by matching the naturally folding point to the line as well. Make sure the side seam and the stitching also line up perfectly. If the amount being shortened is large or if the hem has a flared design, you may also need to taper the hem side. This time, no tapering is needed. If the mismatch is less than 1 mm, you may force it into alignment by hand. Once both side seams are secured, sew all the way around. Now, here's a tip for sewing it together neatly. Place the fabric so that the original needle marks on the hem side. Sit on top of the line drawn on the main body. Then start sewing from the basted side seam position. After sewing about 1 cm, continue sewing so that the original seam is perfectly hidden by the edge of the presser foot. If you keep this position while stitching, the boundary between the main body and the hem area will look neat. Also check the position of the line as you go. For the side seam that is pressed to one side, sew at the position where the original seam comes to the center of the presser foot. Because the fabric layers overlap and become quite thick, it is important to shift it to account for that thickness. Once you get past the thick part, sew again while hiding the seam at the edge of the presser foot. Like this. This way, you can sew it without the seam becoming distorted, even over the thick side seam area. Now shape it with an iron. The ironing here is the most important point for achieving a professional finish. Press the seam allowance to one side so that it all goes inside the fold. Flatten the difference in level made by the joining seam firmly toward the hem side. If this remains, it will clearly look like it was joined here. Ideally, it should feel almost perfectly flat when you touch it. It may be hard to tell on video, but it should be like this. Make it so that the difference in level appears on the back side like this. If you iron over something a bit soft, the fabric will sink downward, and it makes the front side flatter. It may be hard to see, but the level difference is flattened as much as possible. After this, I'll fold along the original crease and sew the stitching. But if there is too much seam allowance, it gets in the way when folding and makes the finished hem even stiffer. So be sure to trim off the excess seam allowance. To do this, trim off the seam allowance on the hem side. You might think that we should leave a smaller seam allowance when cutting. But if it is too short at that time, the cut edge might fray while you are handling it, and you may lose the seam allowance. So it is safer to trim it after the joining stitch is sewn. It should fold neatly with this amount. 8 layers of denim are stacked at the side seam area, so you'll have to reduce the seam allowance more to fold it. First, trim the seam allowance of the overlapped area on the hem side to about 3 mm. Here to about 5 mm. If you cut too much from the main body side, it becomes more likely to tear, so you should cut more from the hem side. This point too, to about 5 mm. and to 3 millimeters here. Now, it has at least become foldable. But since the fabric layers overlap at the side seam, the needle may break if the fabric is stiff. As for jeans, more than 10 layers of denim fabric will overlap, so you usually cannot sew through it. I will sew this part by turning the wheel by hand. But it still would be too hard, so I need to somehow make it thinner and softer. First, place the side seam on something hard. Then apply steam from the iron to soften it, and pound it with a hammer to make it thinner. Hit it fairly hard. But if you overdo it, the fabric will tear. Once, I hit the fabric too hard and it got torn, which caused a lot of trouble. But hitting it this much should make the fabric thin and make it easier to fold. Depending on the thickness of the fabric, you may want to hit the opposite side of the split fabric as well. I'll say it again. Ironing at this stage is the most important point for a professional finish. Let's do a thorough job of preparation here. Now we'll do the stitching. We'll use the upper thread from the unsewn chain stitch. We'll use a number 30 thread for the bobbin thread. We'll thread the unsewn thread. The thread is quite frayed. We'll cut off the frayed parts, but I have a bad feeling about this. We'll use a size 16 needle. If possible, change the needle plate to one for thicker fabrics. It's okay to leave the end of the thread hanging down. Place the fabric so that the right side is visible, and begin sewing. Fold along the original crease. And use your left hand to check the level difference in the folded edge on the back side as you sew. The level difference is now here. At the point where multiple layers of fabric overlap at the side, turn the machine by hand, even with an industrial sewing machine. This is because when you insert a needle into thick, stiff fabric, the needle will bend inside. The needle will almost certainly break if it hits the needle plate, so move it slowly by hand to avoid that. From here on, press the pedal and sew normally. Sew slowly so as not to deviate from the original needle hole. Even a slight misalignment will be very noticeable. Since you must sew without deviating from the original needle hole while checking the level difference with your left hand, I think practice is necessary. Check the unevenness each time. There's no need to sew quickly, so sew carefully while checking the uneven part. Tap this area with a hammer as well. It's not as thick as the other side, but it's best if there's no difference from the other parts. The back side is sewn according to the original needle holes, too. If the stitches are slightly misaligned due to the feed dogs, push them back in by hand. There's a limit to how much you can push them in, so if it doesn't work, undo, and sew it again. Ah! The thread broke. When using the original chain stitch thread, the thread may have deteriorated. The end of the thread was quite frayed this time, so I did have a bad feeling about it. I guess I'll have to sew with a similar colored number 30 thread. It's a shame because it was sewn so nicely, but I'll undo all the stitches. It's best not to use threads with frayed edges like this. It's a pity as it was sewn so nicely. I'll try again with this thread. I'll sew it the same way as before. It's now done. The sides are a little off, but it should be easy to fix by hand. It should look like this. The stitching is perfectly aligned with the original seam. The other side is also a fairly good fit. Well, it's probably okay if the other side is off by about 1 mm from the original needle holes. Finish with an iron. Use the iron to arrange the shape. These jeans have a little stretch in them, so they've become a bit long. I'll press out the stretch as well. That should do it. The fading above the stitching is gone, but I think I managed to preserve a nice texture. One side is altered, and the other is unprocessed. As I mentioned earlier, this method makes the hem stiff. Normally, the stitched area is sewn with 3 layers of fabric. With this method, 5 layers are sewn together, meaning it is like having 2 extra layers of denim interfacing inside. Some customers may be concerned about this stiffness, so be sure to explain this clearly when accepting orders. Also, note that this method is difficult to perform with household or semi-industrial sewing machines. Depending on the item, you may need to sew areas where 8 or more layers of denim overlap. It is best to use an industrial sewing machine, preferably one adjusted for heavy fabrics. This concludes today's video. Thank you for watching. Please give a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. This was Show-ei-mon.